I think we should all collectively give up on chalk because it just smudges, it's a mess, it doesn't last. So let's just forget about it. Don't even give it a go, you know?
Coming from a former chalkboard lettering artist.
Right, exactly. Just don't use it. So tip number 5, thumbnail sketches. I mean, if you doing illustration pieces, you already know that working with thumbnail sketches is a must. Start really small, keeping it simple in the beginning, and really focus on your composition in the beginning. And that also helps you not to focus too much on the details because it's so small. And I really like doing that when I'm working in a collection of a few, like putting them next to each other, especially when I want to maybe add the same type of lettering in different pieces, or make sure that the lettering is connected, that there's a bit of consistency. So I put those together, and then that also helps you to kind of see your work from further away and check if everything is legible, especially if you're working on a smaller size like greeting cards, which is really popular for lettering artists to do. You really have to make sure that it works in a small space. And yeah, anything else that you find helpful in this stage, thumbnail sketches?
Yeah, I always start with like my simple sketchbook that I have just with pencil. I also do what you mentioned before, and what you have shown here in your example is I use blocks to kind of figure out, like, especially when I'm like, if I, for example, I'm designing, like figuring out a design piece, like if I'll use a block of rectangle block to indicate where I'm going to have text. So it's really great for simply putting in your basic shapes of information or imagery and figuring out like whether that composition works well. So in case of lettering, it can really help with your figuring out your hierarchy with those quick sketch blocks. But yeah, the sketchbook for me is always my first step with the thumbnail, and then I like take a picture or scan it in and I put it into Procreate if I'm working in Procreate or whatever software I'm refining it in.
Yeah, I mean, if you work with a sketchbook to start with, obviously you're going to keep your sketches. If you like to start in Procreate right away or any other software, still just make sure that you save your sketches. Maybe even use a separate file, I would say, for those starting sketches so they don't get lost, or you don't, hide them away, because those are really helpful.
I think we've talked about this in past episodes and in the past in general, that like that you can, I always will go back to my sketchbook and look at my old stuff, and like a lot of times you can, especially with thumbnail sketches, where if you're really keeping it simple with just blocks of to indicate what you're wanting to put in, whether it be imagery, text, whatever, you can reuse that. I mean, you're just putting in, plugging and playing different things.
Yeah, I like that. And yeah, I think we mentioned this before, right? That the kind of stuff that you're creating, when you're coming up with a new piece, it is all your inspiration, your experience, is all these like layers of things that are going on inside you that you already have, to turn that all into a new piece. It's like, no, I said it better before, a collage of what you already know, like a finished puzzle of puzzle pieces of things you've already done. I don't know. I have to think of a good metaphor here, but exactly what you're saying. And a sketchbook helps with that, looking at all these different sketches and taking inspiration from all of those different parts.
Yeah, and it's good. It is good to keep all of that stuff, whether or not it's digital or just keeping your sketchbook around. Like I always try to keep them, don't throw them away, because you never know what will spark something else.
True. The next part, tip number 6, is work with your imperfections, or don't fight your imperfections, I would say. All the imperfections that you add, especially to your lettering, they, I think, show your unique point of view, and they help you develop your visual language. And I think, especially with lettering as well, the same thing with illustration, really. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I think sometimes it's more fun to look at something that isn't perfect. As long as people can understand it, it's actually fun to have to look at stuff that has imperfections. And I'm thinking maybe if there's a better word to say imperfections, because I'll show you an example. I did this little series very recently of these like stickers of animals, and I'm mostly focusing on the animal, like the illustration here, but I needed simple letters to go with that. But while I was drawing, I was kind of not paying attention. I was just listening to music. And then I did that O, like a little curl, because that's what I'm used to with my handwriting. And I forgot. And I was like, oh shit, I didn't mean to do that. But then I was like, maybe this could be something interesting to do with all the letters to at least make them a little bit interesting to look at. Now I kind of just want to never change my O ever again and just use like a little curl on my O.
It does really stand out. I noticed it immediately, and I think it kind of really goes with the quirkiness of your toad.
Okay, yes, quirkiness. That is the right word. Thank you. Not imperfections, but quirkiness, like keeping your quirks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Would that be a better way to say it? Because it's not really mistakes or not having things be perfect, but just things that happen naturally. So I would definitely suggest, especially with lettering, look back at your previous work and see what kind of stands out. Like, what have you done that you can just keep reusing, that just kind of happens naturally, because that's you. Like, that's part of how you just put stuff on paper, or what comes out naturally while you're not paying attention. For me, that's also how these like shapes happen, these not perfect shapes. I started with digital lettering on a Samsung tablet, not on the iPad, because I was on a budget trying to figure out if I actually wanted to do this. And so I just used a free app that had very little possibilities. And I honestly just didn't know how to draw straight lines. There was no grid. There was no like holding your pencil so that you get straight lines or straight shapes.
Wow. Yeah.
And so I drew these like borders and shapes, and I was like, they're way off. At some point, I put a ruler on my screen because I was just so lost. And then I was like, fine, I'll just lean into it. Just make them not straight, go full diagonal. I decided to keep it because I kind of found it kind of nice to work that way. And it goes really well with mid-century style illustrations that also have wonky shapes and weird diagonal lines sometimes, and it makes your illustration more dynamic. So lean into the stuff that you see happening in your work, and just use that in your letters.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we talked about before. When I tend to use the same brushes, I've noticed, and the same even mediums when I'm working traditionally. And I have a color like palette that I've developed that I've kind of like used as a reference, but I've actually found that even within that color palette that I set up for myself, that I tend to use the same 10 within it. So I realized that even when I set up a color palette for myself, I tend to use the same colors within it, which I realized has become part of like what makes my, or I guess my style really is. I think a lot of times you can pull that just even from your use of colors. And yeah, I think I've noticed with even my lettering that a lot of it tends to be like the same set of lettering styles that I really like that I'll pull from. So yeah, I think, oh, I remember what I was going to say. We've talked about in the past how like we prefer a lot of times our sketches to begin with. And I think that's where you can pull quirkiness a little bit. So I think that also goes back to number 5 with your thumbnails and why it's so important to really even keep those around. You can go back and study them. That's all going to work towards developing your point of view, your style, because people like resonate with that a lot more when it's authentic, when it's you.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the beginning, when you feel like you don't really know what you're doing, or it's more tempting to emulate as much of what is already out there because you feel like that's what you're supposed to do. I mean, that happens all the time. That's normal. But eventually, I think you realize that a lot of what you do in your sketches is just really personal, and people want to see more of that. And yeah, we did talk about it before, how I think we've both had that experience where we were working with a client and it turned out that the sketch was just what they preferred seeing, and that you sometimes just have to go back to that original sketch because it has a lot more personality. The next thing is I just called it tools. Tip number 7. have a look at tools, I guess, and don't give up too easily. I said that I started out doing stuff by hand, and I got introduced to lettering in university, where the first step that a lot of people take with lettering is, the guides that you have by hand, and then using a brush pen, and then you follow those lines, like the thick and the thin, the thick and the thin, and you try those over and over, just because that's a good way to start doing lettering by hand. And so that's what I had to do in school as well, like pages and pages of like, all right, get this down first, and then we'll do the letters. And I'm left-handed, so if you're using ink pens or brush pens, it can get messy very easily. And the way that these letters work by hand, the same thing with calligraphy or handwriting, is that the thick and the thin of your directions mostly work for a right-handed pen. So if you do stuff left-handed, you're doing things the opposite way, and it just doesn't work as well. And I was just covered in ink the whole time, like my elbows were covered in ink, and I just hated doing it. So I was like, I'm giving up on this. Like, this is way too messy. It doesn't look good. And I was like, well, lettering is not for me, I guess. So I gave up on that. Then as a second try, I tried a Wacom tablet. Do you know what that is?
I have one.
Oh, okay. All right. So you use that, you draw on the side, right? And then you see what you're drawing on your screen, like in Photoshop or Illustrator. But because your hand isn't directly on paper or on a screen, I found it really difficult to connect the two. Like, I found it difficult for my hand to be on one side, and then the screen like looking somewhere else.
Yeah, I had difficult. It's like something you have to get used to, and I don't know if I really ever got over it until I got my iPad. And there's an app that you can get. It's called Astropad. It
Oh yeah.
turns your iPad into a drawing pad. And so that was really the only way I really was able to use that type of idea of using the iPad though as my drawing pad, as basically the Wacom tablet. But it's easier because
Okay.
I could still just concentrate on my iPad, and it was recording it like as I was working it like on my screen. So
Yeah.
yeah, I would recommend that if you're having trouble with that disconnect that you can kind of get sometimes with a Wacom tablet. They also
Yeah.
have updated versions of a Wacom tablet where it's a little bit more like an iPad now, but they're more
Oh
expensive. I think
yeah.
it's like the Wacom Cintiq.
I've
Um,
heard of that. Yeah. But yeah, that is to say that like sometimes your tools like might just not work for you, and it's okay if it's never going to work for you. Like, don't give up. Don't think that you could just never do it then, because that's what I thought. I tried the brush pens, hated it. Then I tried the Wacom, and I was like, okay, well, I'm never going to be a lettering artist. I'm never going to be able to do digital illustration, because I didn't really know what was out there years ago. It wasn't until I got my first client for doing menu designs, like chalk designs for a big restaurant chain, that I was like, okay, I need to figure out something that works for me, either chalk or using paint that looks like chalk. And it wasn't until I used those techniques that I was like, okay, I think I can do this. This works way better. And then later on, I used a Samsung tablet and then upgraded to an iPad, and used the Apple Pencil. And I was like, finally, like I felt like a world had opened up. So even if you've tried a few materials and you're like, it's not for me, specifically for lettering, there might be other stuff out there that's easier to use. And I hear sometimes people say like, I've tried the lettering markers, and it's just not working that well. Some cheaper ones also just don't work that well. I would recommend, I mean, we'll talk about tools in a minute, but I would recommend just giving it another try, giving it a second chance, trying something else, because you might have not found your perfect material or technique or tool just yet. And it certainly doesn't have to fit in a box either. So, as an example, a lot of stuff that I do is very adjacent to sign painting, but I am certainly not a sign painter. There are, with the really long brushes, like doing the different logos and stuff like that, I can certainly not do that, but I can sort of do a fake version of that by using easier brushes and stuff that is a little bit different, just like using acrylic paint. It doesn't, like, you don't have to fit into a certain box to be able to use certain tools. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think it also goes back to our earlier tip number 3, which is practice. And with practice, you'll learn the tools that work best for you. Your story is really interesting because you're left-handed, and I'm sure there's other left-handed lettering artists out there. So it'd be interesting to hear if anyone who's watched this, who's also left-handed lettering artists or practicing it, what they've done. Maybe leave a comment.
Yeah, for sure. And ask other people too. Ask other illustrators what they like to use, because sometimes it just takes a while to figure it out. There's loads of resources out there, but until you try it, you don't know if it works for you. It took me a while to figure out, especially when it comes to doing stuff by hand with acrylic pens and paint, to see like what would work for me. Because in the beginning, I mean, if you're writing from left to right, you're just rubbing everything out slowly. I've done so much just like rubbing everything out and just sitting there in frustration of like, how do I do this? It just takes a while to figure out what tools you need. And the last thing I would say when it comes to finding clients for lettering or illustration in general, really, is that if you use tools that might not be the tools that people would expect you to use, or you're using something different, that can help you find your niche as well. I found it really helpful when I was looking for clients for doing restaurants, like murals in restaurants and stuff, that I was not using the typical just chalk on a chalkboard, which is what a lot of people were using. And that then appealed to restaurants who were like, well, we want something that's a bit more permanent, that's not going to like fall off, or like, you know, when people walk by and stuff, we need something that's more permanent. So we actually like that you're the one person who does that. And also, because you're using acrylics, you can put that on the wall and on the windows and outside. So that helped me to like build because of that. And in the beginning, I thought using a different tool was a weakness, but it can most certainly be a strength as well.
That's really interesting. One thing I've also talking about, like learning also how to use the tools that I know I've done in illustration and lettering, like when I do it traditionally, is I'll put like a sheet of paper down, because I'm right-handed, but I also tend to at times smudge, especially with graphite, and I'll have like my hand all like with whatever material, but I found that putting a piece of paper down with my hand over it helps a lot. You still kind of have to be careful because sometimes your stuff will be wet and you have to make sure it's dry before you put it down. But it does make it a lot easier. You just have to be a little bit slower with working. But all that stuff, like with using your tools and with practice that we've mentioned, it just, you know, it just takes time to kind of figure out what works for you and what works best.
Yeah. Smudging is the word that I was looking for. I think we should all collectively give up on chalk because it just smudges. It's a mess. It doesn't last. So let's just forget about it. Don't even give it a go, you know?
Coming from a former chalkboard lettering artist.
Right, exactly. Just don't use it. That brings us to tools. That's the last thing that I think is really important. So firstly, I think the one we have in common is Procreate, right? That one is kind of our go-to. Do you have any other tips or anything specifically in Procreate that's helpful?
Definitely using the grids in there. I use those a lot. I love the monoline brush. I'm not sure exactly where I got it, but you can buy all types of monoline brushes, but I love using that specifically, those type of brushes, for just getting the outline of the lettering shapes. So I'd recommend that. I think those are the two basic things that I would definitely recommend for lettering and Procreate. Oh, I also have some grids.
Yeah.
You can buy also like grid stamp brushes for composition layouts, and I have used a couple of those before. So yeah, I would recommend that. Oh, and also, I guess I'm thinking more now that I'm talking about it. I use the symmetry tool in Procreate.
Oh yeah.
You can set it so it'll basically,
it's really helpful.
Yeah, it'll mirror like what you do on the other side. You can set it exactly where you want it. And so you can like, it's really good for like shapes like A, where it looks the same on both sides, specifically for going for like a sans serif type A. So anything, that type of thing.
So I mean, I love Procreate as well. Even if I do stuff by hand, I will usually make my sketches Procreate. And what I really like to do for stuff that's going to be done by hand is make a mock-up. So I'll just put the photo of where the piece is going to go into Procreate. On another layer, I'll start like the outlines of the lettering on that, which is quite helpful. And look into, for your brushes, look into the streamline of your brushes, which you can adjust. So if you want to do lots of like round shapes and flourishes, you can really up that streamline. I forgot what it's called or stability, I think. You can adjust the stability of your brushes, of your pen, to make sure that those shapes are a bit more like natural if you need help with that.
So I think when you're talking about adjusting, making it more stable, that's would be in the property settings for whatever brush you're using.
And for example, for this piece, I love you to Reese's Pieces. I put together some brushes myself. So I made those to help me with my needs. So I also love the monoline brushes in Procreate, but I really like when the letters have the same width. So I just doubled that kind of monoline style brush to make sure that I can always have that same width when I'm writing. So you can easily make custom brushes in Procreate to help you with your letters. It's pretty easy to do. And stamp brushes too.
I actually bought a brush and it's called a dual. It basically is a double line, so it makes it, I've used that as well. It makes it really easy when you're like trying to get like your outline, but even faster, because it does like both sides and the thickness that you want. Yeah, it's awesome. I use that too as well.
Yeah. So you can either buy those brushes separately, or if you have some more time, try and figure out to make them yourself. It's great. That kind of stuff really helps. And then apart from Procreate, anything else on the iPad you found helpful? Any software that you like to use for letters?
I think I mentioned before I like using Astropad. What I find like that's if I'm using it more as a tablet, like an Illustrator. So if I've done some like traditional lettering, like pen and ink or something like that, and I want to refine it or make it a vector in Illustrator, I'll use Astropad app so I can turn my iPad into a drawing pad. I think those are the main things that I use. Yeah.
Yeah, and Illustrator as well.
I usually use it with Astropad, but sometimes I can get my sketch well enough. Like I would recommend, sometimes I'll make it like really high contrast. I'll either do that with making like if I use like a black Sharpie or a black pen, white paper, I'll scan that in and I'll pull it into Illustrator, and then you can use the live trace tool in Illustrator to create a vector of it. And a lot of times I'll use like the smooth tool in Illustrator because a lot of times even when you live trace, there'll sometimes be some like real like wonk, like they're just like real jagged type lines, and I use a smooth tool to kind of like smooth that line out, smooth the edges, and that helps a lot. Yeah, I think those are my main things that I use.
I would also recommend, as an alternative to Procreate, Adobe Fresco, which is pretty good. Just have different types of abilities there, and you can use that together with Illustrator and Photoshop as well if you like to finish your pieces there. That's quite helpful. And then if you prefer working only in vectors, Curve works quite well. That used to be called Infinity Painter, and I added that to our research blog post at some point. And that is really helpful for doing stuff that you maybe want to import into Illustrator as well. So quite helpful for lettering. And anything by hand, is there something that you think is a really good option for people to try lettering with?
Always the sketchbook, definitely. Also just like trying out, like whenever I'm in an art store, I always like check out different pens. Like I have like practically a whole jar full of just different pen types that I've tried and that I liked, and figuring out. So those micron pens I think are pretty cool because you get the different like thicknesses and styles. There's like the brush pen style, and like there's more like the chisel tip. So just like playing with that type of stuff. I do have some of the Tombow markers. I've really only kind of started really getting recently into markers. in general, but more for illustration, not as much for like lettering. For lettering, I mostly like just starting out with like a pencil on my sketchbook and then building it up in Procreate. Yeah, I think pens, different pens, like ink also is really good. I like using like a little like calligraphy tip pen. If you're working more traditionally, one thing that I have used a lot in the past with lettering is refining my sketches further with a light box. That's a good tool to have on hand.
Oh, a light box.
If you don't have a light box, before I had one, I used just a sunny window. I put my sketch up against and put my paper that I wanted to transfer on top of it. So you can do that. But yeah, a light box is a really good tool for refining if you don't want to invest in a light box, or tracing paper is what I meant. Tracing paper is a good also tool to have.
Oh yeah.
To further refine your lettering and your sketches and stuff like that. So yeah, that's another thing I would recommend as well. I think those are my main things that I would recommend trying out. But you can really use anything for lettering. Like you had the example of using food. So
yeah, true.
I tend to use traditional and digital media like interchangeably a lot in the same work. So, and I have a blog post about that. And our first episode also went further into that. And we'll provide the link, and it has a case study of how I combine traditional and digital media.
And you have lettering in that piece too.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say as well for when I use acrylic paint, when I do like menu designs or murals, apart from just using brushes, if I want to do finer stuff, I'd use Posca markers. I found those quite helpful. And Molotov, which isn't, you can't get that everywhere, but Molotov One for All, I think mostly they have some stores in Europe. They have refillable pens, which are perfect for lettering, if you can find those. But they don't have stores everywhere, so maybe Posca markers are a bit easier to find, or something similar. I mean, there's loads of materials out there. And just as you said, right, just going to a craft store and trying out different materials, trying out different pens and markers is helpful too. And just anything outside of the box that you could think of. I've used food before. As an example, I did this Netflix and chili piece. And I used food for this, which also made sense with the context. So these are like sesame seeds and chili peppers. And I mean, lots of lettering artists use very unconventional materials and tools like food or clay or I don't know, whatever you can think of. And you can just do exclusively that. That works too. For this, obviously, I started with a sketch, but after that, the execution, you can do that in any tool that you can think of. So definitely experiment with that. And I realized I don't think I really mentioned that you should start with short sentences. Maybe in the first step, start with like short sentences, and puns and wordplay is perfect for doing lettering because it's short and that makes stuff a lot easier. I could not imagine doing this piece with like sesame seeds and stuff if it was really long. So start as small as possible when you're trying out different tools, and yeah, just keep it simple.
That's a really good point. I see a lot of lettering artists, they'll even just do drop cap letters or just like one letter in different styles.
Yeah.
So you can do that.
Yeah, that's a good,
it doesn't even have to.
great example.
I think the first lettering challenge I did in October, I think it was just one word. I just stuck to one word, and just to keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah, that's a great way to do it. Yeah, definitely don't do like big, like motivational sentences. That's really, really complicated. And that makes that you have to think so much more about composition and about your tools and about the balance and the contrast and negative space. And like, I never pick anything longer than 4 or 5 words because I don't want to. So,
yeah.
And if you want to try out how to do lettering specifically in Procreate, with those brushes that I mentioned and, you know, learning a bit more about composition, this piece I did in a tutorial that you can check out for free. I made that available together with those specific dual brushes that we mentioned so that you can give that a try. And I think that'd be helpful for beginners just to see that it's really not that difficult and you really don't have to be an expert to make something like this in Procreate.
That looks really fun. So I think that wraps up all the tips we have for this episode. Stay tuned for the next one and leave in the comments below any tools that you use that you would recommend or that we may not have mentioned that you think would be useful to others. We'd love to hear them.
Yeah.
Oh, I lost my train of thought. This happens to me all the time.
It's okay.